Welcome back to the course on English Varieties. Today's talk I'd like to start by quoting the story of the Tower of Babel. This legendary narrative was meant to explain why peoples of the world speak different languages. It says, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves.' The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, 'Look, they are one people, and they have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech.' So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth." This is quite a powerful story to my mind, which provides quite a simple explanation on why people speak different languages. What seems relevant about the story to me is the word confusion, because I see a lot of confusion concerning the concept of a language. Even the most trivial things regarding languages cause heated debates among the scholars and among the public. For instance, linguists still argue about the number of languages in the world. They suggest figures ranging from 5,000 to 7,000. Such confusion is partly caused by the arbitrary distinction between languages and dialects. Let's consider a couple of examples. Before the 1990s, Serbo-Croatian was generally considered a single language with two variants. However, due to social and political changes, now Croatian and Serbian are treated as separate languages. On the contrary, Hakka, Cantonese, and Mandarin are classified as the three dialects of the Chinese language, even though there are more linguistic differences between them than between Swedish and Norwegian. Thus, the practical problem of differentiating languages and dialects is of great importance for the linguists around the world. Let's regard possible solutions. At first glance, the question of differentiating languages and dialects may seem easy. If two people speak differently, there are only two possibilities. If they understand each other, they speak the same language, and the differences in their speech boil down to the dialectal differences of one and the same language. However, if the speakers don't understand each other, they must speak different languages. That is why scholars could use the criterion of mutual intelligibility to solve the problem. However, this criterion cannot be applied very easily in several cases. If a Russian hears a piece of the text in Belarusian, he or she is likely to define the sample as a different language, even though there would be quite a few words identical in both languages, and general listening comprehension would be rather good. Although they can potentially understand each other, Russians and Belarusians would agree that they speak different languages, but not the dialects of one and the same language. Let's consider another example. Here you can pause the video and read the text written in Jamaican Patois, an English-based Creole language. Even though there are very few words that are written and pronounced like in Standard English, there is a strong likelihood that many English speakers would consider Jamaican Patois a dialect of English, rather than a separate language. The text can be decoded when a few peculiarities are revealed. The famous fairy tale written in Jamaican Patois is likely to be understood by English speakers simply because the syntax of this English variety is almost the same compared with that of Standard English. These examples demonstrate that Russian and English speakers tend to estimate the intelligibility of the samples differently. Russians understand more words of Belarusian often English speakers understand words of Jamaican patois. However, the former consider Belarusian a separate language, whilst English speakers are likely to regard Jamaican patois as a dialect of their mother tongue. There are other difficult cases where it is hard to draw a line between a language and a dialect. For instance, there is a well-known example that demonstrates a peculiar case of the direction of intelligibility. Germans do not understand what a native Dutch speaker says, but on the contrary, Dutch speakers can easily understand what Germans say. Well, when one treats intelligibility as a subjective criterion, it causes lots of problems. So that's why the question arises, is it possible to utilize intelligibility as a scientific method to differentiate languages and dialects? Well, Yuri Korякov, a Russian linguist, has conducted such research. He compared a number of languages and dialects with the help of Swedish lists. A Swedish list of words is traditionally used in historical linguistics to establish a genetic relationship between various languages. It comprises 100 basic words that are present in every language. Words denoting family relation, for example, mother, father, brother, simple numerals 1, 2, 3, and so on. Applying statistics, Korякov has established a minimal level of intelligibility at the rate of 91% and has got rather interesting results. Most of the languages he compared coincided with the long-established statuses. For example, English and German apparently fell into the category of different languages. However, 5 Scandinavian languages, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, Icelandic, and Faroese, comprise only 2 separate languages, where Norwegian and Swedish are the 2 dialects of one language. On the contrary, the dialects of the Italian language, according to Koryakov's research, should be treated as 5 different languages, as the similarities between their word lists turned out to be less than 91%. Koryakov's method seems very promising because it utilizes scientific methods of statistics that have been widely used to resolve various complicated issues. This method can be successfully used to establish the distinction between the languages and dialects of various ethnic minorities. However, I doubt that it can be applied for sovereign nations, such as Chinese or Italians. So, does the lack of universal methods to distinguish languages and dialects mean that we have no idea what a language is and what a dialect is? Is it impossible to define these notions? In fact, scholars know enough about languages and dialects. They have described quite a few features characteristic of languages. Let's consider several of them that can be useful to define the key terms of this talk, namely a language and a dialect. The first feature to be considered is standardization. Each language at a certain level of its development requires a certain degree of standardization, which is reflected in grammar books, spelling rules, dictionaries, and even literature. The language that has not undergone the process of standardization is called vernacular. Traditionally, dialects are not standardized. If a dialect is standardized, it becomes language standard. A language standard is governed by a set of norms, which are another feature worth looking at. Norms are concrete codified rules, which makes them more specific than standardization. The latter is a general phenomenon, objective and discrete. It is either present or not. The norms always give a qualitative characterization to a language. According to norms, some language phenomena are treated as good, others as bad. Another aspect of a language is vitality. This feature refers to the existence of a living community of speakers. Languages may be alive or dead. Once the language is dead, it is extremely hard to know anything about its dialects. The language may be preserved through centuries in written texts, while dialects may be gone completely. Autonomy is a rather subjective feature. Autonomy is the matter of a feeling. A language must be felt different from other languages. Finally, let's consider reduction. Linguistic aspects of a language, such as pronunciation, semantics, and syntax, allow variation. That means that there are several variants of how a particular word may be pronounced. You can say car or car. You can say tomato or tomato. There are several ways to construct a negative sentence. You can say I'm not or I ain't. You can form degrees of comparison differently. You can say prouder or more proud. And you can construct your sentences using different grammatical phenomena. You can say my brother's car, or you can say the car of my brother. You can arrange objects of a predicate differently. I gave John the book, or I gave the book to John. So the language allows you to express one and the same thought differently. Dialects do not allow such variations. Therefore, a dialect is simply a reduced version of a language. That is why we can say that in standard British English we pronounce the word butter with an alveolar stop in the middle. In Cockney, another dialect of British English, you pronounce the same word as ba'a with a glottal stop in the middle. And finally, in American English, you can pronounce this word as butter with a flap in the middle and the sonorant r at the end. These features help to describe the key aspect of a language and a dialect. Thus, a language may be regarded as a system of signs that is governed by a system of rules. According to these rules, the signs are combined in order to express thoughts and enable communication. A dialect is a reduced form of a language which is not standardized and lacks norms, but it does not lack in rules, because a dialect is also a system of signs that is governed by a system of rules. This system also enables thought expression and communication, and the only difference is that a dialect lacks sign variation, so to speak. So, I've mentioned some features that are characteristic of languages and that are not characteristic of dialects. However, if a certain dialect acquires the above-mentioned features, does it mean that such a dialect should be treated as a single language? Well, the short answer is no, and the longer answer is as follows. Some scholars argue that there should be only two criteria to label a dialect as a separate language, and none of them are related to linguistic properties of the variant of interest. One of these criteria is to have a community of speakers with a single mind about the matter. That means that the majority of people should agree that the variety they speak is to be regarded as a separate language. Secondly, this community of speakers should have enough political and economic power to make its decision be respected by outsiders with whom it is in regular contact. With regard to the existing varieties of English, these two criteria have rarely been fully satisfied. I know only one English variety which has come close enough to proclaim itself a single language. The variety of interest is Scots. It is spoken in lowland Scotland and parts of Ulster in Ireland. Here on the slide you can see the text written in this language. You can try and read it. I guess you can understand the general idea of this text even though you don't speak this particular language. The Scots language developed during the Middle English period as a distinct entity from the Northern dialect of English spoken those times. Thus, modern English that you know and Scots have one common ancestor or proto-language, and it is Old English. That is why you can understand this particular language by reading the text. Scots is now officially recognized as a West Germanic language
under the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages by the Council of Europe. According to the 2011 Scottish census, about 1.5 million people speak Scots nowadays. Under the political and social pressure, the English government has recently recognized Scots as a regional language, and it is now officially taught in Scottish schools, even though some scholars still argue that Scots is just the dialect of English. So it seems again that the political power plays a crucial role in establishing a difference between a language and a dialect. Thus, one might agree with the definition of a language given by the linguist Max Weinreich. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy.
Of course, this approach offers an arbitrary distinction being established between languages and dialects, which contributes to the confusion of languages I've mentioned at the beginning of this talk when referred to the story of the Tower of Babel. Nevertheless, even societal attitudes toward languages and dialects are being investigated and to a certain extent are being governed by scientific methods.
The government has always been interfering with the way people talk and the languages they use. The direct interference of this sort is seen at the level of education. The government of a country regulates what languages should be taught at schools and in what languages the education should be conducted. Various activities carried out by the officials in order to regulate a language use within the borders of a particular country constitute its language policy. For most of the time, linguists have rarely taken part in shaping language policy. However, nowadays, scholars more and more often act as experts, whose opinion is taken into account while discussing language policy of a country. In certain cases, linguists do not just influence language policy, but implement it. For example, the Institute of Linguistics of the Russian Academy of Science has launched a massive campaign aiming at documenting and preserving languages of ethnic minorities of Russia. There have been created a number of electronic platforms that collect texts in many languages of Russia, with the aim to use them as tools to teach endangered and minor languages. American linguists have developed perceptual dialectology, a branch of linguistics that investigates how non-linguists perceive variation in language. The study helps to debunk popular myths about dialects and fights stigmatization of certain dialects that is based on linguistic prejudice and stereotypes. However, the goal of this course implies the study of two branches of linguistics that research language variation, namely dialectology and sociolinguistics. For a long time, the study of variation in languages was part of the subject of dialectology, which aimed to identify all the ways in which a language differed from one place to another. Dialectology, or in other words, dialect geography, was developed by neo-grammarians, a group of German philologists who studied Indo-European languages in the 19th century. Their best-known data-gathering technique was to send researchers, also called field workers, mainly into rural areas, where the speakers were believed to be less influenced by other accents. There they found elderly speakers and used lists of questions to find information about vocabulary and pronunciations. The questions being chosen to concentrate on items known to vary a lot from region to region. With the help of the data collected in such field trips, the scholars divided the maps of a country into regions where people spoke different dialects. So basically the aim of dialectology is to define natural borders for the regional dialects and present them on linguistic atlases with the help of isoglosses. Surveys conducted by dialectologists have provided the basis for many useful generalizations. about geographical variation. But they have serious weaknesses. Dialectology concentrated too much on rural varieties, tended to be interested in archaic forms of the language, and took little notice of variation due to social class, education, and other such factors. More recent research has tended to be carried out within the framework of sociolinguistics and has tried to cover urban speech with a balanced coverage of age and social classes. Sociolinguistics studies how and why language varies within social contexts. In other words, it studies social dialects. A social dialect refers to the differences between one social group and another. This can cover such matters as gender, ethnicity, religion, age, and very significantly, social class. The scholars usually distinguish the following social class markers: age, profession, and level of education. In fact, some scholars note that social class-based language differences may have far graver social implications than regional variation. Varieties associated with lower classes may be highly stigmatized and their speakers subject to social sanction, while dialects associated chiefly with a certain region may be thought of simply as interesting or unusual. To investigate social dialects and factors that influence them, sociolinguists utilize a different from dialectologists set of methods. One of the classic sociolinguistic studies on the correlation between social prestige and language variation was conducted by William Labov in 1966. His goal was to identify whether the use of post-vocalic correlates with the social status of the speakers in New York. He decided to talk to sales assistants in 3 different types of department stores: a fairly cheap Samuel Klein, a more upscale Macy's, and a really upmarket Saks. He went into each department store and looked for an item situated on the 4th floor because he wanted to listen to the answer, 4th floor, given to the question like, "Where are the ladies' coats?" So William Labov would approach a sales assistant asking the question, "Where are the ladies' coats?" The sales assistant would answer, "On the 4th floor." After that, Labov would fake being hard-hearing and would ask the sales assistant to repeat the answer. Where? On the 4th floor, he would be given an answer. In fact, what he did was to elicit the response in a more casual and in a more careful way. The outcomes of his study are presented in the table. Labov found out that there was a difference between the 3 department stores in the way the sales assistant pronounced R in the post-vocalic position. It turned out that in New York City in the 1960s, it was quite posh and prestigious to pronounce the final R in the post-vocalic position. You find this feature less in cheap department stores, only 8 and 18% respectively for the casual and careful speech in Samuel Klein stores. And you find this feature quite a lot in upscale Macy's department stores, 44 and 61% respectively, and you find it really frequently in upmarket department stores, 63 and 64%. The second responses to the question asked by Labov showed that there was a huge increase in pronunciation of the final R in the 2 low-class department stores, meaning that sales assistants tended to pronounce the final R more often when they articulated the words more carefully. The ultimate outcome of Labov's study was that a number of dialect features showed regular patterns according to the speaker's social class. Speakers in lower class groups showed low levels for standard or prestige features. Conversely, speakers in higher social class groups use standard and prestige features more frequently and non-standard features less frequently.
To sum this information up, if a variety of a language is determined by a geographical criterion, it should be called a regional dialect. And the branch of science that studies this phenomenon is called dialectology. If the variation is determined by a social factor, such as age, gender, profession, it is called a social dialect, and it is studied by sociolinguistics. However, one should not forget that dialects vary not only across different territories and social groups, but at the level of an individual.
An individual variety of a language specific to a particular person is called the idiolect. An idiolect refers to the linguistic repertoire of an individual and encompasses individualistic features of vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. Idiolects are often studied by forensic linguists who attempt to identify whether a certain person did or did not produce a given text by comparing the style of the text with the idiolect of the individual. However, the identified features of an individual idiolect are not set in stone. If you notice that a speaker says ain't instead of am not, it does not mean that there is zero chance to hear them say am not. It is likely that in a certain situation, this speaker may use a feature that you don't expect them to use.
So, what do we have now? We have established that linguists have been studying languages for quite a long time and discovered a lot of facts by using scientific methods. However, purely linguistic issues sometimes are not resolved with the help of science. The issue of differentiating languages and dialects quite often is tackled by the society and governments. Despite having developed specific branches like dialectology and sociolinguistics, science has to take into account the societal attitude towards the matter of interest. Sometimes it leads to the confusion in the use of terms. For instance, now scholars tend to use the term variety instead of dialect. The term dialect has a number of negative associations, mainly because of the myth that non-standard dialects of English are grammatically deficient. So linguists use the term variety as it lacks any negative meanings.
Besides, linguists use a bunch of other terms that can be confusing. For example, you can often hear the word accent. It refers only to the phonological side of language variation. When scholars talk about American accent or British accent, they consider only phonological differences between these accents, thus neglecting the existence of other differences, such as lexical and grammatical. So, an accent is a sum of phonological features characteristic of a certain language variety. For the lexical side of language variation, the terms jargon and slang are used. The term slang is used chiefly to talk about lexical items specific to a particular social group, often youngsters. Slang words typically carry some sort of non-neutral social meaning and usually have non-slang synonyms that are more neutral in tone. For example, you can say to kick the bucket, or you can say neutrally to die. Further, slang words are usually considered to be short-lived, though in reality some slang terms have been around for generations. For example, the term dough for money has been around since at least the early 20th century. Jargon also pertains to the lexical level of language and refers to terms associated with a particular sphere of activity. For example, computer jargon or legal jargon.
Well, if this is not confusing enough, do not forget that all these forms of variation change within speakers. So you can hear one and the same speaker utilizing various forms of pronunciation or vocabulary or grammar. However, the confusion that people have about languages and dialects is not caused, in my view, by the existence of similar terms or even by the interference of a society in order to make arbitrary distinction. It is our desire to see everything as discrete that confuses a lot of things concerning a language. We are accustomed to seeing everything with clear borders. Thus, it is conventional for us to think that languages and dialects should have clear borders. If we draw a line or an isogloss on the linguistic atlas, it should clearly divide one dialect from another. But you see, language varies not only across the speakers, but within the speakers, within each of you. We should not treat a language as a discrete phenomenon with clear borders, but more like a continuum. Using the metaphor of my previous talk, if a language is a mosaic, then this mosaic has fuzzy borders.